Welcome to the Bird's Eye View. This series is not meant to be a political or cultural commentary, nor is it a nitpick or comprehensive review. What we will be doing is diving into entertainment to try to understand its message, how well it accomplishes this, what we can learn from it, and how it might be improved. So let's look into it. In this video, we're going to be asking the question, does She-Hulk make sense? What is the quality of She-Hulk? We're going to be looking at how does it succeed in its message and how does it fail. Fundamentally, She-Hulk is about the duality of perception and the nature of being an other. She-Hulk wants to be seen as Jennifer, as a complete person, but this becomes a struggle because of how she's viewed and judged by those around her, especially intelligentsia, which represents the most negative aspect of this. Ultimately, she succeeds, and we're going to be discussing how she does that and how the show does a good job of reinforcing these messages going forward. Now, first we'll talk about how it succeeds. This show does an excellent job of showing, rather than telling, how the world around her objectifies her as She-Hulk, and makes her feel isolated because she's forced to fit just in that narrow scope. For instance, she's hired as a diversity hire, as an affirmative action type thing, in order for her to actually get a job. She's forced, by basically contract, to only present as She-Hulk, thereby forcing her, basically objectifying her in a kind of superhero fashion, to only be a certain area. But also, when it comes to her dating life, she could only find dates as She-Hulk.
Oh, why is that an alert? I'm not proud of this.
Lights, camera, action.
Again, this goes to show how society and how the culture around her forces her into a narrow version of herself. And unlike a lot of other TV shows, movies, etc., which will just preach to you this conflict or the theme or the message, whatever you want to call it, that they're trying to focus on, instead, you do see the struggles up close and personal, very specifically, very concretely, how She-Hulk is mistreated by those around her. It also does a good job of echoing this struggle through multiple different layers of the story. Regardless of if it's big or small, so many of even the side concepts, the side stories, involve ideas of perception. Like, for instance, Titania being on social media, being basically a snake oil salesman that leans into the fears of the public, while also taking away the trademark, not allowing She-Hulk to be able to seen on her own accord as well. We see this even in regards to small things, like the shape-shifting elf, impersonating celebrities to try and con people. We also see the same ideas of perception when she has to look for the underground supersuit maker. So over and over again, we see these concepts of perception being echoed across multiple different layers, multiple different B-plots and examples. And this does a good job of giving us different ideas or just different angles of the same core themes. Another particular bright spot, I thought, was how they did a good job of showing Abomination change from being this rage monster, military type, to being a in touch with himself, mindful yogi guru.
Jennifer Waters.
Mr. Blonsky, I was expecting...
Abomination, right? No, you won't be seeing much of him about. I've completely transformed myself. I'm simply a meal now.
Aside from this being just a fun comedic concept, it's also a good opportunity for She-Hulk to work on integrating her own self, the opposite aspects of her own self, and having to grapple with that, which is something they did try to do in one of the later episodes when they had their support group. While this video is mostly about seeing how well She-Hulk did in promoting its message, I also want to touch on some of the messages overall, meaning some of the ideas at the core. And the reason I say that is because this show really did a good job with a lot of these inventive ideas. I think the idea of a Hulk in therapy is brilliant and really could make for some very hilarious comedic moments. Though at times Matt Murdock did seem to be tacked on, I will say that his addition to it helped a lot in reinforcing the core idea that Jennifer really wanted in a romantic connection, full openness, or someone who really accepted who she was as Jennifer, and not just looking for someone who wanted her to simply be She-Hulk alone. I think a lot of its core themes are very interesting and haven't been touched on much in superhero media, but also the finale is really unique. And when I watched it for the first time, it was genuinely surprising that she would come out and go straight into the Disney Plus section and then confront Kevin Feige, who turns out to be a robot. These are some really unique, cool ideas that had a lot to them. Now for the second part, how it fails to illustrate its point, how it falls short. I'm afraid She-Hulk fails in one of the most fundamental ways any project can fail, by directly contradicting its own message. The message of being objectified, treated as an other, and seen as only a shallow, two-dimensional version of yourself is very compelling, but this show makes the fatal error of treating its character in exactly the same way. Who is Jennifer? We know she's a lawyer who has vaguely stereotypical feminist views and wants a boyfriend, but aside from this caricature, who else is Jennifer truly? If you're coming up blank, it's because they did not do a good job of showing us who she really was. We saw that she was a lawyer, but what were her hobbies? What were the things she was really interested in? Why did she become a lawyer? Why did she have this struggle of feeling objectified and feeling she was on the outside the whole time? Now, I'm not saying that many women don't deal with this, but what in particular made it so hard on her? Every woman, every man, every person might have similar core conflicts to a lot of other people, but they're still unique. The way that they interact with those struggles that are common is what makes them unique. That's the difference. And that's exactly what She-Hulk lacked. It lacked that uniqueness. So this whole time, it is preaching to us in more ways than one, in some ways that I agree with and I think are quite interesting, quite fascinating, and yet it decides to fall short of exactly that idea of seeing people for who they really are, of looking beneath the surface. It doesn't give us a look beneath the surface. It doesn't show us who Jennifer is, and furthermore, it doesn't do the same thing with the other characters. The secondary characters end up being basically glorified caricatures themselves. These one-dimensional, two-dimensional cutouts of the stereotypical lawyer frat boy or the supportive best friend. Not only does this same issue apply to the secondary characters, but the villains themselves also struggle with this, which of course is a common complaint when it comes to Marvel, but on every front, these characters end up coming across as cliched, stereotypical, and one-dimensional. But particularly in regards to this show, that is a fatal flaw. Why? Because this show is about the perception of people. It is about being objectified, being one-dimensional, being otherized, and yet we as the audience don't see. We don't see these people in greater detail. We don't see their bigger struggles. We only see the very surface-level details that the show presents. And that leaves us not really identifying with She-Hulk, or the bonus characters, or the villains. It leaves us feeling on the outside, which is exactly the opposite of what She-Hulk should have done. Thus, the show becomes almost the antithesis of its message, showing every aspect or every person on the political or cultural spectrum the worst version of their bugaboo, whether that is She-Hulk being a cringy feminist or the frat boy lawyer being the worst representation of toxic masculinity. It shows every character being a caricature, a stereotype of their particular group, thereby being the exact opposite, the nemesis to the very meaning, the very message of the show itself. Finally though, the ending, while original and potentially excellent, fell short in several key ways. Most importantly, it hinges on the concept of Jennifer telling her own story. But what even is that story? Like we discussed earlier, we don't really know who she is beneath the surface. So how can it truly tell us, or how can she go on to tell her story when we as the audience don't really know what that story even is. Furthermore, she even has the ability to break the fourth wall and talk directly to the audience themselves, and yet she doesn't even use this ability to talk about her past, or even talk about something that is not incredibly specifically related to the objects of that episode. So she might talk about the episode or the season or the things that have gone on surrounding it, but not about things outside of it. A flashback from her childhood or some weird grudge that she had. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on the conflicts and the problems inside of this season alone. Because of this, the ending, while it could have been good, it could have been great even, did not truly have the weight it could have had, because we don't know what that story that she needs to tell is. So she confronts these writers, she confronts Kevin to take control of her season, to take control of her own show, saying, "This is mine, I want to tell my own story." And yet, what is there to tell? What does she in fact tell in the end? Nothing of true substance. Instead, it stays in this cliched, narrow bubble that she's been in the entire time. Aside from this, from a villain perspective, she never really confronted intelligentsia. Instead, she goes to the writers, who are confirmed, or at least showed to us as being the big bad people, the people who set her up and took away her story and did things on her behalf without her being able to choose. And yet, the writers being the bad guy was not set up earlier. They were not foreshadowed. Aside from knowing that she could break the fourth wall, the writers as an ultimate villain were not something that we knew about ahead of time. The ones we did know about were intelligentsia, not the writers, and not even Kevin. So the first problem with the writers being the villains is that they weren't set up. They were not shown, built up, none of that. Instead, it was this twist at the end that, again, on paper, might have had some good ideas. It could have been pretty funny. It could have been a really good commentary on how you shouldn't allow other people who are above you or those around you to take over your life and make choices for you and define you and to tell you who you really are. That could have been interesting. However, it wasn't set up. It was not made to be a constant through line. But furthermore, because of this, it ended up being a deus ex machina, because the villain we did have, intelligentsia, was never truly confronted. Instead, they were quite literally written out of the story, confronted off-screen, dealt with off-screen, and we never got the conclusion of her actually grappling with the villains that we knew as the audience. So while a lot of the ideas of She-Hulk were quite profound, and at times could have been comedic gold, instead, it served as its own enemy by undermining its own plot, its own themes, and its own message, by not allowing the characters to be truly in depth, to allow the audience to see them fully and accept them as people. Instead, they were treated as cliches and props. And then the villains were either stereotypical and underdone, but ultimately ended in nothing. The intelligentsia, we never saw her confront, and when they were confronted, they were off-screen and literally written out by her. And then when she confronted Kevin and the writers, if they were truly the bad guys, they weren't set up, they were not foreshadowed, and so the audience is left longing in more ways than one. This video has been a look at, does She-Hulk make sense? How does it treat its message, themes, and plot? And I hope I've done a good job of answering that. If I was forced to choose between yes or no, I'd probably choose no. It doesn't make sense ultimately because it defeats a lot of its purposes like I discussed. In the next video on She-Hulk, we're going to be taking a look at what we can learn from it. We'll be answering the question, what can we learn from She-Hulk? What can we learn in a writing sense, if we were to write a story? But what can we also learn as far as the message itself? What did the message teach us about being human, about growing as people? Even if it's an incomplete story, I think those are still worthwhile questions. So I'll see you then.